practical terms, the structure of the economy and those factors that are spurring the economic growth in East Africa are unlikely to and do not have the potential of creating sufficient employment. Let me give you 4 examples. The growth in the service sector has largely been driven by the auctioning of some of the service industries to external interests. Where there has not been such auctioning, the procurement rules applied by the civil service are such that it has made it difficult for a very long period of time for young people to competitively become players in the economy or the economic opportunities created by the service sector. You require 5 to 10 years experience, you need to have bank records, and so on. So it's things that young people who have just started their businesses, because we have encouraged them to become entrepreneurs, are unable to do. The second, take the new finds, mining and mineral resource finds, whether it's oil in Lake Albert, Lake Turkana, wherever. Those kinds, we've known, for example, for quite about a decade now, about the existence of oil and other natural resources, such as natural gas, in these areas. Very little has been done in careering or in diverting or in coordinating or directing our education system so that it's able to produce the sort of skilled labor that we require for these new mineral wealth finds. So what does this mean? It essentially means that in order to exploit oil, natural gas, coal, whatever it is that we find, rare earth that we're finding, we will have to inevitably rely on external expertise, right? That means the entry of our people into these markets is as low level or unskilled labor. So these sectors, in any event, mining does not create a lot of jobs. It creates a minimum set of jobs. And the jobs that matter the most would be within the skilled labor category. So our investments in science and technology, our investments in mining, engineering, in allied, legal, accounting, and other training is nominal. So our education and training system is not keeping up pace with our ambition of growth, or what we have, I think, put on paper as the likely drivers of growth. Then you come to agriculture. So this region is actually unique in the sense that if you look at the average age of the new farmers, it has the highest number of young people that are engaged in agriculture or agro-based industries. But it's still a very small fraction compared to the rest. But it's clear with the sort of interest that you're getting from the UAE, from the Saudi, from the Emiratis, from the Kuwaitis, from everybody else inland within this region, that land is going to play a decisive factor in production to feed our own populations, and production to feed other populations that have either run out of land or run out of water. So it seems to me that very little is being done to match the so-called youth dividend with transboundary resources that are likely to generate a windfall, or nationally based resources that are likely to create opportunities. So where opportunities exist, structurally, we've locked out these young people, at least for the next 15 to 20 years. So the disconnect between what we have in abundance and what is earning us super profits, and the control of both, as in who controls the real economy, who controls the financialized economy, is such that it's not young people, right? It is mostly not locals. If they are locals, they are simply proxies of some other foreign interest. So structurally, it seems to me that the ambition to have young people enter the economy, benefit from the opportunities in the economy, diminishes when you look at policy and practice of government and of the private sector, which would bring you to ICTs, because much has been said about ICTs being a potential conduit of growth in the region. You will realize that the number of jobs created do target inevitably a certain elite. They don't deal with the lumpenization that's happening in the rural sector or in the urban areas. So in essence, you still are privileging mostly those who are privileged. I know that there are programs in Kenya and elsewhere to try and deal with education within the informal settlements or slums, but this is hardly sufficient to address the magnitude of the problem. So you now will have something that I learned from a colleague, Dr. Otibe Ibuzo, is called intergenerational poverty. That means one generation of poor people are likely to give birth to another generation of poor people, because structurally we have not created the pathways for exiting that poverty by deliberate focus and investment in those areas. So where are we with youth? In a nutshell, we're at a stage where there's a conspiracy by the economic policy against young people, conspiracy by state elites who oftentimes rhetorically commit to youth empowerment, but in practice, everything they do, whether it is the looting and the corruption or simply the policy making, is such that no young person is likely to benefit. And then the magnitude of the problem means that we need to rethink. We need to rethink using the geospatial lens first. Where are the poor youth that we need to empower? By and large, in all the economies of East Africa, the majority of the young people that we're talking about are within the rural sector. So micro-enterprise development in the rural sector, micro-infrastructure, domestic capital formation and local economies in the rural sector become important. So whether it's youth as primary producers, youth as dealing with the agro-based industries or service sector or servicing, assisting access to market, transportation, all the feeder industries becomes important. It's an ecosystem or a value chain system that you grow deliberately by determining. More sustainable forms of agriculture obviously would work best for young people because it's lower inputs in terms of you are not investing a lot of money in chemical fertilizers and all sorts of complex seeds. But it would also mean that if we get the appropriate technology that enables that sort of increase in yield per hectare, increased productivity within the rural sector, it makes it worth the while for young people who are looking for returns. But just having increased productivity without having more equitable market access or a just market access which is not distorted by middlemen would not solve the problem. So that's the one thing, the agricultural sector. The second is there are policy interventions that could be done. So the government needs to, in a sense, our governments need to deal with the policy question around funding or financing of youth development initiatives. Now, as long as the financing is debt, as long as the financing happens without any other form of support, it's going to lead to a consumptive, super consumptive pattern. So which would mean that cooperatives, productive cooperatives, might be a solution. This region has a history of SACCOs. Whatever their limitations may be, thinking of cooperative business ventures with some form of guarantees, backstopping, support, mentorship may be something to look at, in the sense that you're not creating opportunity for one clever entrepreneurial young person, but you're getting a whole cluster and a group who have common interests, getting them to work together on this. And that means we need to change laws. That means we need to change structure of registration of companies, non-for-profit companies. That means we have to rethink this whole point around how do we do impact investment in order to build inclusive businesses. So the rethinking of our entire economic paradigm, the rethinking of our conception of commercial law and practice, the rethinking of how our economy generates value becomes very important. So, for example, the one thing that youth have, which is skills, which may not be skills tested over a long period of time, skills in the field of technology, for example, in the creative arts. So you come into this country with frightening amounts of talent in terms of creative arts or fine arts. There's no industry for that, right? Yet foreigners reap billions of dollars for all the Kenyan runners, right? And sports persons, for all the Kenyan musicians. The amount of money each one of them or the sector reaps by way of benefit is laughable. And it will not change as long as there's no coherent structure, as long as no regulatory framework is put in place to ensure that the exploitation is dealt with. The youth of East Africa will not be liberated by President Museveni, President Kagame, President Kenyatta, Prime Minister Abiy, and Nkurunziza, and Magufuli, so on and so forth. I think part of this conversation we're having is decoupling the notion of youth from three sad ideas. This notion that begins to take youth as a permanent condition, as opposed to a very time-bound transit position, that if nothing is solved when you are still in this transitory period called youth, these problems will be problems when you are an adult, right? The lack of employment of a young person does not necessarily translate into an employment of adult, right? So that we are not solving a youth problem. We're solving a broader economic structural question about employment in the economy, right? Because you're only youth up to a certain age, 35, and then you become an old unemployed person, right? So that's the first thing we need to resolve. The second thing we need to resolve is the notion that someone somewhere has the solution. A donor, a government, a leader. The idea that liberation cannot be postponed, liberation and the things that matter to give you your full humanity must be fought for through deliberate and conscious social struggle against economic and political forces that seek to rob you of humanity. And this therefore means the youth of this region must not only agonize, they must organize. To organize, you need consciousness. Consciousness requires a clear set of ideas and a collective vision of what that future will look like for you, right? And this sometimes is lacking because the struggle is sublet to donors, to funders, to governments, and then people become resolutionaries. When a government says, or the president says the right statement about young people relax, even if they're going back every day home to poverty, to 1 meal a day, and so on and so forth. I think this needs to be addressed. The third issue is the notion that we can escape the mess that we are in. This whole idea that we can always go to America, we can always go to the United Kingdom, like China or India. The reality of the matter is we are not wanted there. And since we have no spare continent or spare country, we have to fix the one continent that we have. And you can't fix something that you do not believe in. And you don't believe in something because it is perfect. The allegory of the gold miner is simply this. The person who mines gold has to dig through a lot of dust and dirt in order to get to the precious mineral. Once he's gotten the precious mineral, he still has to put it through the crucible or the fire to refine it. And so the challenge for me, for youth, is not determined by what external factors, such as governmental policy and action, although that is important, such as donor investment and private sector, although that is important. What determines the outcome, or what will become of the young people, the future of the young people, the present generation in East Africa, is the extent to which they are willing to get off their laurels and struggle for the things that matter. Is the extent to which they are willing to realize that there will be no Santa Claus who will bring jobs, who will bring housing. It won't happen. Every other generation that got these things did it through the trenches. They fought for what they believed. They dared not allow anyone to ignore them because they would say, nothing for us without us. You can't shave our heads in our absence.